I was the primary, both my parents, my mother had metastatic lung cancer. And basically from the time of diagnosis to the time she passed, it was about 9 months. My dad, on the other hand, has been probably for about the last almost 20 years now, had a variety of heart ailments and lung ailments, as well as also prostate cancer. And the major reason he had been hanging on for so long was because my mom was essentially taking care of him. And he was a dialysis patient because basically his kidneys seized up 5 years ago after having sepsis, contracted sepsis in the hospital.
Would you say that your experience as an EMS professional, did that give you any additional skills in working through that situation?
Yes, it did. It basically made me aware of what to look for and what not to look for, as well as also dealing with a lot of their problems. I mean, my mother was actually very late in getting her cancer diagnosis, despite our constant prodding of her healthcare provider to look for something else, because they were trying to make it into a generic lung disease, and because she never admitted that she was a smoker. She would not admit that she was a smoker, so they thought it was some weird lung disease, and they had some pulmonary specialist until finally they saw it had metastasized to the lymph nodes.
There's a lot of stress involved. Patients, particularly on home hospice or home palliative care settings, they get very little assistance as part of the Medicare coverage usually. So it's a full-time job for family and friends to be caring for these people. They're very debilitated again. So there's the stress of actually physically caring for them, moving them, providing their medications, bathing, those kind of things. And then there's the additional stress of knowing that they're losing a loved one. So there's a lot of stress involved, and it's not a job to be taken lightly.
Biggest problem was, especially when I ended up being a primary caregiver, was the fact that I had to be careful on when I could travel. And also was the fact that I always had to check on the parents, first and foremost. We got into a routine where that if everything was, happy, and, everybody wasn't going through any additional strains, I could, basically we had Sunday as family day. So I would go in and do all kinds of things around the house. The other problem that I had with my parents was they didn't want to be a bother. So they very much tried to not actually have to have me come over so often. And that actually was perhaps the biggest stressor, because I had to go over there more often just to check on them, because they never would tell me when they needed help. Towards the end of my dad, this was after my mom died last September of '07. My dad died in February of '08, and right after Christmas, it was actually 2 days after Christmas, he basically passed out, went unconscious in my arms, climbing the stairs. And essentially was totally unresponsive, and I had to call 911. And I went through the 911 process, and what I was trying to get the call takers to do and say, this is who I am, this is what I need. And it was very frustrating, because the call takers were doing what they were trying to do and going over the ECD, their little flip charts. And unfortunately, while I appreciate that, I knew what was going on, and this is what I needed. And then, make matters worse, when the BLS crew from another agency comes on scene, they don't do anything. There's a fireman that came with a fire truck from the beginning, and he's assisting me, stabilizing them. But the basic crew does absolutely nothing. Instead, they sit there and basically wait and stare until an ALS commercial crew comes in, and then they basically do the patient care and transport. At that time, I didn't really necessarily have any feelings, other than the fact that I was a little bit upset that nobody was really doing anything. Being from a different agency, I'm used to when one of our crews gets on scene, if it's BLS or even if it's ALS, and you have somebody down and unresponsive, Bill will try to get in and try to take charge. And that was extremely frustrating, but perhaps the other thing, because, these guys I found out later were just following their standard operating procedures because they don't bill. So if they have to have ALS ride along, they have ALS do the entire transport. So that was kind of frustrating. Mind you, the ALS crew was very professional and was outstanding. As soon as the BLS crew got on scene, and in fairness, my father had started to come around a little bit, so he had started to stabilize. They should have probably forced me off treating my own father, because I know as a professional, though, and mind you, I could see where it would be a problem because the way I was wired at the time, but as a professional, I know that it's never good to have a relative trying to be the primary caregiver in an emergency situation. You tend to lose your scope, and I'm very narrow, obviously, in that scope. Everybody was in a hurry, to get, the critical patient out into the bus and on his way to the hospital, but nobody bothered to take a look at my sister. I actually rode, with the ALS crew to the hospital, and unfortunately, nobody thought, and I later found out from my sister, was that she was frazzled of having to have to drive to the hospital by herself, and nobody took the time to actually talk to her. And I think, and unfortunately, we're so resource starved in this region for when we get crews on scenes. I think as good as that could be and as good as that should be, it would take a radical change and more availability of resources to cover that. Most of the time, and knowing this from working the other side of the street, as well as also working with my parents, is the only reason that my parents got access to their resources because I knew about those resources from working the EMS side of the street. And most people, unfortunately, don't know what's available out there. And I think that especially when crews get on scene and stuff, if they actually have a chance to spend some time with the patient, pointing them in the right direction where they can get resources is a good thing. And quite frankly, most of the time, the only way people actually get uptake into a lot of resources is because the crews take them to the hospital and they pull the triage nurse aside and say, these people really need a visit by social work. And then at that point, they actually start getting into the system. But unfortunately, by that time, it's a little bit too late. That message would be is to think that you always have two patients. You have the patient that is critically ill and actually needs your service, but then you also have the patient from a psychological standpoint that's trying to take care of those people. And, they also need access to support. And unfortunately, most of the time they don't get it, and they kind of sort of tough it out, which could potentially lead to two patients that really need to go to the hospital.